Arts. Greek art had a profound influence on Roman art. Public art, including sculpture, monuments such as victory columns or triumphal arches, and the iconography on coins, is often analyzed for historical or ideological significance. In the private sphere, artistic objects were made for religious dedications, funerary commemorations, domestic use, and commerce. The wealthy advertised their appreciation of culture through artwork and decorative arts in their homes. Despite the value placed on art, even famous artists were of low social status, partly as they worked with their hands. Portraiture. Portraiture, which survives mainly in sculpture, was the most copious form of imperial art. Portraits during the Augustan period utilized classical proportions, evolving later into a mixture of realism and idealism. Republican portraits were characterized by verism, but as early as the 2nd century BC, Greek heroic nudity was adopted for conquering generals. Imperial portrait sculptures may model a mature head atop a youthful nude or semi nude body with a perfect musculature. Clothed in the toga or military regalia, the body communicates rank or role, not individual characteristics. Portraiture in painting is represented primarily by the Fayum mummy portraits, which evoke Egyptian and Roman traditions of commemorating the dead with realistic painting. Marble portraits with sculpture were painted, but traces have rarely survived. Sculpture and sarcophagi. Examples of Roman sculpture survive abundantly, though often in damaged or fragmentary condition, including freestanding statuary in marble, bronze, and terracotta, and reliefs from public buildings and monuments. Niches and amphitheaters were originally filled with statues, as were formal gardens. Temples housed cult images of deities, often by famed sculptors. Elaborately carved marble and limestone sarcophagi are characteristic of the 2nd to 4th centuries. Sarcophagus relief has been called the richest single source of Roman iconography, depicting mythological scenes or Jewish Christian imagery, as well as the deceased's life. Painting. Initial Roman painting drew from Etruscan and Greek models and techniques. Examples of Roman paintings can be found in palaces, catacombs, and villas. Much of what is known of Roman painting is from the interior decoration of private homes, particularly as preserved by the eruption of Vesuvius. In addition to decorative borders and panels with geometric or vegetative motifs, wall painting depicts scenes from mythology and theater, landscapes and gardens, spectacles, everyday life, and erotic art. Mosaic. Mosaics are among the most enduring of Roman's decorative arts and are found on floors and other architectural features. The most common is the tessellated mosaic, formed from uniform pieces, tesserae, of materials such as stone and glass. Opus sectile is a related technique in which flat stone, usually colored marble, is cut precisely into shapes from which geometric or figurative patterns are formed. The most difficult technique became especially popular for luxury surfaces in the 4th century, e.g., the Basilica of Junius Bassus. Figurative mosaics share many themes with painting, and in some cases use almost identical compositions. Geometric patterns and mythological scenes occur throughout the empire in North Africa, a particularly rich source of mosaics. Homeowners often chose scenes of life on their estates, hunting, agriculture, and local wildlife. Plentiful and major examples of Roman mosaics come also from present day Turkey, particularly the Antioch mosaics, Italy, southern France, Spain, and Portugal. Decorative arts. Decorative arts for luxury consumers included fine pottery, silver and bronze vessels, and implements and glassware. Pottery manufacturing was economically important, as were the glass and metalworking industries. Imports stimulated new regional centers of production. Southern Gaul became a leading producer of the finer red gloss pottery, terra, terra sigillata. That was a major trade good in the first century Europe. Glass blowing was regarded by the Romans as originating in Syria in the first century BC, and by the third century, Egypt and the Rhineland became noted for fine glass. Performing arts. In Roman tradition, borrowed from the Greeks, literary theater was performed by all male troupes that used face masks with exaggerated facial expressions to portray emotion. Female roles were played by men in drag, travesti. Roman literary theater tradition is represented in Latin literature by the tragedies of Seneca, for example. More popular than literary theater was the genre-defying mimist theater, which featured scripted scenarios with free improvisation, risque language and sex scenes, action sequences and political satire, along with dance, juggling, acrobatics, tightrope walking, striptease, and dancing bears. Unlike literary theater, mimes was played without masks and encouraged stylistic realism. Female roles were performed by women. Mimes was related to pantomimes, an early form of story ballet that contained no spoken dialogue but rather a sung libretto, often mythological, either tragic or comic. Although sometimes regarded as foreign, music and dance existed in Rome from earliest times. Music was customary at funerals, and the tibia, a woodwind instrument, was played at the sacrifices. Song, Carmen, was integral to almost every social occasion. Music was thought to reflect the orderliness of the cosmos. Various woodwinds and brass instruments were played, as were stringed instruments such as the cithara and percussion. The corno, a long tubular metal wind instrument, was used for military signals and on parade. These instruments spread throughout the provinces and are widely depicted in Roman art. The hydraulic pipe organ, hydraulos, was one of the most significant technical and musical achievements of antiquity, and accompanied gladiator games and events in the amphitheater. Although certain dances were seen at times as non-Roman or unmanly, dancing was embedded in religious rituals of archaic Rome. Ecstatic dancing was a feature of the mystery religions, particularly the cults of Cybele and Isis. In the secular realm, dancing girls from Syria and Cadiz were extremely popular. Like gladiators, entertainers were legally infamous, technically free but little better than slaves. Stars, however, could enjoy considerable wealth and celebrity, and mingled socially and often sexually with the elite. Performers supported each other by forming guilds, and several memorials for theater members survive. Theater and dance were often condemned by Christian polemicists in the later empire. Literacy, books, and education. Estimates of the average literacy rate range from 5 to over 30%. The Roman obsession with documents and inscriptions indicates the value placed on the written word. Laws and edicts were posted as well as read out. Illiterate Roman subjects could have government scriba, read or write their official documents for them. The military produced extensive written records. The Babylonian Talmud declares if all seas were ink, all reeds were pen, all skies parchment, and all men scribes, they would be unable to set down the full scope of the Roman government's concerns. Numeracy was necessary for commerce. Slaves were numerate and literate in significant numbers. Some were highly educated. Graffiti and low quality inscriptions with misspellings and solecisms indicate casual literacy among non elites. The Romans had an extensive priestly archive, and inscriptions appeared throughout the empire in connection with votives, dedicated by ordinary people as well as magic spells, e.g., the Greek magical papyri. Books were expensive, since each copy had to be written out on papyrus roll, volumen, by scribes. The codex, pages bound to a spine, was still a novelty in the first century, but by the end of the third century was replacing the volumen. Commercial book production was established by the late Republic, and by the first century, certain neighborhoods of Rome and western provincial cities were known for their bookshops. The quality of editing varied wildly, and plagiarism or forgery were common, since there was no copyright law. Collectors amassed personal libraries, and a fine library was a part of the cultivated leisure, otium, associated with the villa lifestyle. Significant collections might attract in-house scholars, and an individual benefactor might endow a community with a library, as Pliny the Younger did in Comum. Imperial libraries were open to users on a limited basis and represented a literary canon. Books considered subversive might be publicly burned, and Domitian crucified copyists for reproducing works deemed treasonous. Literary texts were often shared aloud at meals or with reading groups. Public readings, recitaciones, expanded from the first through the third century, giving rise to consumer literature for entertainment. Illustrated books, including erotica, were popular but are poorly represented by extant fragments. Literacy began to decline during the crisis of the third century. The Emperor Julian banned Christians from teaching the classical curriculum, but the Church Fathers and other Christians adopted Latin and Greek literature, philosophy and science, and biblical interpretation. As the Western Roman Empire declined, reading became rarer, even for those with the church hierarchy, although it continued in the Byzantine Empire. Education. Traditional Roman education was moral and practical. Stories were meant to instill Roman values, modus maiorum. Parents were expected to act as role models, and working parents passed their skills to their children, who might also enter apprenticeships. The young children were attended by a pedagogue, usually a Greek slave or former slave, who kept the child safe, taught self discipline and public behavior, attended class, and helped with tutoring. Formal education was available only to families who could pay for it. Lack of state support contributed to low literacy. Primary education in reading, writing, and arithmetic might take place at home if parents hired or bought a teacher. Other children attended public schools, organized by a schoolmaster. Ludimagister, paid by parents. Verne, homeborn slave children might share in-home or public schooling. Boys and girls received primary education generally from ages 7 to 12, but classes were not segregated by grade or age. Most schools employed corporal punishment. For the socially ambitious, education in Greek as well as Latin was necessary. Schools became more numerous during the empire, increasing educational opportunities. At the age of 14, upper class males made their rite of passage into adulthood and began to learn leadership roles through mentoring from a senior family member or family friend. Higher education was provided by grammatici or rhetores. The grammaticus or grammarian taught mainly Greek and Latin literature with history, geography, philosophy, or mathematics treated as explanations of the text. With the rise of Augustus, contemporary Latin authors such as Virgil and Livy also became part of the curriculum. The rhetor was a teacher of oratory or public speaking. The art of speaking, ars dicenti, was highly prized, and eloquentia, speaking ability, eloquence, was considered the glue of civilized society. Rhetoric was not so much a body of knowledge, though it required a command of the literary canon, as it was mode of expression that distinguished those who held social power. The ancient model of rhetorical training, restraint, coolness under pressure, modesty, and good humor endured into the 18th century as a Western educational ideal. In Latin, illiteratus could mean both unable to read and write and lacking in cultural awareness or sophistication. Higher education promoted career advancement. Urban elites throughout the empire shared literary culture imbued with Greek educational ideas, paideia. Hellenistic cities sponsored schools of higher learning to express cultural achievement. Young Roman men often went abroad to study rhetoric and philosophy, mostly to Athens. The curriculum in the East was more likely to include music and physical training. On the Hellenistic model, Vespasian endowed chairs of grammar, Latin and Greek rhetoric, and philosophy at Rome and gave secondary teachers special exemptions from taxes and legal penalties. In the Eastern Empire, Berytus, present day Beirut, was unusual in offering a Latin education and became famous for its school of Roman law. The cultural movement known as the Second Sophistic, 1st to 3rd century AD, promoted the assimilation of Greek and Roman social, educational, and aesthetic values. Literate women ranged from cultured aristocrats to girls trained to be calligraphers or scribes. The ideal woman in Augustan love poetry was educated and well versed in the arts. Education seems to have been standard for daughters of the senatorial and equestrian orders. An educated wife was an asset for the socially ambitious household. Literature. Literature under Augustus, along with that of the Republic, has been viewed as the golden age of Latin literature, embodying classical ideals. The three most influential classic Latin poets, Virgil, Horace, and Ovid, belong to this period. Virgil's Aeneid was a national epic in the manner of Homeric epics of Greece. Horace perfected the use of Greek lyric meters in Latin verse. Ovid's erotic poetry was enormously popular but ran afoul of Augustan morality, contributing to his exile. Ovid's metamorphoses wove together Greco Roman mythology. His versions of Greek myths became a primary source of later classical mythology, and his work was hugely influential in medieval literature. The early Principate produced satirists such as Perseus and Juvenal. The mid-first through mid-second century has conventionally been called the Silver Age of Latin literature. The three leading writers, Seneca, Lucan, and Petronius, committed suicide after incurring Nero's displeasure. Epigrammatist and social observer, Martial and the epic poet Statius, whose poetry collection, Sylvae, influenced Renaissance literature, wrote during the reign of Domitian. Other authors of the Silver Age included Pliny the Elder, author of the Encyclopedic Natural History, his nephew Pliny the Younger, and the historian Tacitus. The principal Latin prose author of the Augustan age is the historian Livy, whose account of Rome's founding became the most familiar version in modern era literature. The Twelve Caesars by Suetonius is a primary source of imperial biography. Among imperial historians who wrote in Greek are Dionysius of Halicarnassus, Josephus, and Cassius Dio. Other major Greek authors of the empire included the biographer Plutarch, the geographer Strabo, and the rhetorician and satirist Lucian. From the 2nd to the 4th centuries, Christian authors were in the active dialogue with the classical tradition. Tertullian was one of the earliest prose authors with a distinctly Christian voice. After the conversion of Constantine, Latin literature is dominated by the Christian perspective. In the late 4th century, Jerome produced a Latin translation of the Bible and became authoritative as the Vulgate. Around the same time, Augustine wrote The City of God Against the Pagans, considered a masterpiece of Western culture. In contrast to the unity of classical Latin, the literary aesthetic of late antiquity has a tessellated quality. A continuing interest in the religious traditions of Rome prior to Christian dominion is found onto the 5th century with the Saturnalia of Macrobius and the marriage of Philology and Mercury of Martinus Capella. Latin poets of late antiquity include Ausinius, Prudentius, Claudian, and Sidonius Apollinaris. Religion. The Romans thought of themselves as highly religious and attributed their success to the collective piety, pietas, and good relations with the gods, pax deorum. The archaic religion believed to have come from the earliest kings of Rome was the foundation of the mas maiorum, the way of the ancestors, central to Roman identity. Roman religion was practical and contractual, based on the principle of do ut des, I give that you might give. Religion depended on knowledge and the correct practice of prayer, ritual, and sacrifice, not on faith or dogma. Although Latin literature preserves learned speculation on the nature of the divine, for ordinary Romans religion was part of daily life. Each home had a household shrine to offer prayers and libatations to the family's domestic deities. Neighborhood shrines and sacred places such as springs and groves dotted the city. The Roman calendar was structured around religious observances. As many as 135 days were devoted to religious festivals and games. Ludi. In the wake of the Republic's collapse, state religion adapted to support the new regime. Augustus justified one man rule with a vast program of religious revivalism and reform. Public vows now were directed at the well being of the emperor, so called emperor worship expanded on a grand scale. The traditional veneration of the ancestral dead and the genius, the divine tutelary of every individual. Upon death, an emperor could be made a state divinity, divus, by vote of the Senate. The Roman imperial cult, influenced by a Hellenistic ruler cult, became one of the major ways Rome advertised its presence in the provinces and cultivated shared cultural identity. Cultural precedent in the eastern provinces facilitated a rapid dissemination of imperial cult, extending as far as Iran in present-day Saudi Arabia. Rejection of the state religion became tantamount to treason. The Romans are known for their great number of deities they honored. As the Romans extended their territories, their general policy was to promote stability among diverse peoples by absorbing local deities and cults rather than eradicating them. Building temples that framed local theology within Roman religion, inscriptions throughout the empire record the side by side worship of local and Roman deities, including dedications made by Romans to local gods. By the height of the empire, numerous syncretic or reinterpreted gods were cultivated. Among them, cults of Cybele, Isis, Epona, and of solar gods such as Mithras and Sol Invictus, found as far north as Roman Britain. Because Romans had never been obligated to cultivate one god or cult only, religious tolerance was not an issue. Mystery religions, which offered initiate salvation in the afterlife, were a matter of personal choice. Practiced in addition to one's family rites and public religion, the mysteries, however, involved exclusive oaths and secrecy, which conservative Romans viewed with suspicion as characteristic of magic, conspiracy, conjuratio, and subversive activity. Thus, sporadic and sometimes brutal attempts were made to suppress religionists. In Gaul, the power of the Druids was checked, first by forbidding Roman citizens to belong to the order, and then by banning Druidism altogether. However, Celtic traditions were reinterpreted within the context of imperial theology, and a new Gallo-Roman religion coalesced its capital at the sanctuary of three Gauls, established precedent for Western cult as a form of Roman provincial identity. The, monothe- the monotheistic the monotheistic rigor of Judaism posed difficulties for Roman policy that led at times to compromise and granting of special exemptions. Tertullian noted that Judaism, unlike Christianity, was considered a religio licita, legitimate religion. The Jewish-Roman wars resulted from political as well as religious conflicts. The siege of Jerusalem in 70 AD led to the sacking of the Second Temple and the dispersal of Jewish political power. Christianity emerged in Roman Judea as a Jewish religious sect in the first century and gradually spread out of Jerusalem throughout the empire and beyond. Imperially authorized persecutions were limited and sporadic, with martyrdoms occurring most often under the authority of local officials. Tacitus reports that after the Great Fire of Rome in AD 64, the emperor attempted to deflect blame from himself onto the Christians. A major persecution occurred under the Emperor Domitian, and persecution in 177 took place at Lugudunum, the Gallo-Roman religious capital. A letter from Pliny the Younger, governor of Bithynia, describes his persecution and executions of Christians. The Dacian prosecution of 246 to 251 seriously threatened the Christian church but ultimately strengthened Christian defiance. Diocletian undertook the most severe persecution of Christians from 303 to 311. From the 2nd century onward, the Church Fathers condemned the diverse religions practiced throughout the empire as pagan. In the early 4th century, Constantine I became the first emperor to convert to Christianity. He supported the church financially and made laws that favored it. But the new religion was already successful, having moved from less than 50,000 to over a million adherents between 150 and 250. Constantine and his successors banned public sacrifice while tolerating other traditional practices. Constantine never engaged in a purge. There were no pagan martyrs during his reign, and people who had not converted to Christianity remained in important positions at court. Julian attempted to revive traditional public sacrifice in Hellenistic religion, but met Christian resistance and lack of popular support. Christians of the 4th century believed that the conversion of Constantine showed that Christianity had triumphed over paganism in heaven, and little further action besides such rhetoric was necessary. Thus, their focus shifted towards heresy. According to Peter Brown, in most areas, polytheists were not molested, and apart from a few ugly incidents of local violence, Jewish communities also enjoyed a century of stable, even privileged existence. There were anti pagan laws, but they were not generally enforced. Through the 6th century, centers of paganism existed in Athens, Gaza, Alexandria, and elsewhere. According to recent Jewish scholarship, toleration of the Jews was maintained under Christian emperors. This did not extend to heretics. Theodosius I made multiple laws enacted against alternate forms of Christianity, and heretics were persecuted and killed by both the government and the church throughout late antiquity. Non-Christians were not persecuted until the 6th century. Rome's original religious hierarchy and ritual influenced Christian forms, and many pre-Christian practices survived in Christian festivals and local traditions. Legacy. Several states claimed to be the Roman Empire's successor. The Holy Roman Empire was established in 800 when Pope Leo III crowned Charlemagne as Roman Emperor. Tsardom, as inheritor of the Byzantine Empire's Orthodox Christian tradition, counted itself the third Rome, Constantinople having been the second. In accordance with the concept of translatio imperii, the last Eastern Roman titular, Andreas Palaiologos, sold the title of Emperor of Constantinople to Charles VIII of France. Upon Charles' death, Palaiologos reclaimed the title and on his death granted it to Ferdinand and Isabella, with their successors who never used it. When the Ottomans, who based their state on the Byzantine model, took Constantinople in 1453, Mehmed II established his capital there and claimed to sit on the throne of the Roman Empire. He even launched an invasion of Otranto with the purpose of reuniting the empire, which was aborted by his death. In the medieval West, Roman came to mean the Church and the Catholic Pope. The Greek from Romaioi remained attached to the Greek-speaking Christian population of the Byzantine Empire and is still used by the Greeks. Roman Empire's control of the Italian peninsula influenced Italian nationalism and the unification of Italy, Risorgimento, in 1861. In the United States, the founders were educated in the classical tradition and used classical models for landmarks in Washington, D.C. The founders saw Athenian democracy and Roman republicanisms as model for the mixed constitutions, but regarded the emperor as a figure of tyranny. With that in mind, the entire Wikipedia, except citations and notes on the Roman Empire, has been read, and I will fill the video with something else.